All right, good afternoon, everybody. Hope everyone's well. So this presentation today is the reason it's so pertinent is because we all know it's a bit of a buyer's market right now, and this is kind of the best time to talk about this. So many times I have agents come in the office, and they say, "I have a listing. Nothing's happening. I'm not getting any showings. I'm not getting any appointments booked." We can all relate to that. The sellers are getting antsy. They're getting a little nervous and they're saying, what am I doing? What am I actually doing to sell the house? Now, the problem is we can do all the wonderful things we do. We list it on MLS, Facebook ads, Instagram, open houses, all of that. But at the end of the day, when it's a slow market, we all know the main thing is price. The thing that moves a house is the price. So what this is this is coaching sellers through realistic expectations. Because we all know that when someone lists a property, they list it as high as they can as possible because they want to get as much money as they can for the property. And the idea is that we want to manage that expectation to be realistic of what the market dictates the property is worth. So this presentation is all about coaching sellers through realistic expectations in a slow market. So why does this matter? So sellers often believe their home will sell fast and above market value. Unrealistic expectations equals overpriced listings, frustration, and expired contracts. So realtors who coach effectively earn trust, loyalty, and referrals. Now, I'll tell you, how many times has it happened where somebody's listed a property, you have an agent list a property, let's say the house is worth 1.2 in the market, but the sellers want to list it for 1.4. You say, okay, we'll list it for 1.4. You don't want to lose the listing. You have it listed. It's on the market for 30 days, 40 days. You suggest a price reduction. They say, no, that's what we want. And all of a sudden they turn around and they say, we want to list it with another agent. You're not selling the property. So it gets released. A new agent lists the property. They list it for 200,000 less than you had it listed for. And lo and behold, they sell the property. And the reason is for two things. One, they actually manage the expectation of the seller. And usually the other reason is the seller is so exhausted from keeping the place nice, the stress of trying to sell the property. They want to get their life in track and move that they finally give in to the second agent and they reduce the price. Whereas if you were the agent that got that price in the beginning, you would have sold the property. Does it make sense what I'm saying? So realtors who coach effectively earn trust, loyalty, and referrals. And we're going to talk about how we do that today. Because being effective in your communication, in the knowledge that you possess in terms of the market, the value of the property, and how you approach the seller will make things a lot easier for you and allow you to sell more houses. So, seller's mindset. The problem with a seller is they have an emotional attachment. My home is worth more. I know it's old laminate, but I did that myself. I laid that with my son back in 1986. There's nothing wrong with it. That's beautiful laminate flooring. What do you mean that that pedestal sink is outdated? I've had that pedestal for 20 years. It works perfectly. The end of the day is there's an emotional attachment and you're anchoring to peak market prices. Social proof bias. My neighbor got X last year. Fear of losing money. So let's go through all of the reasons why a seller has a different expectation than what there is. So for example, if you look at 2021, the seller has a neighbor next door that sold their house for 1.5. Now the houses are worth 1.3. Their expectation is that it's going to be worth 1.5. It was a different market. Interest rates were different. The lay of the land was different without all the politics that were involved, everything else. The market has peaks and valleys. The idea is that you have to educate your seller on what the actual value of the property is based on the market at the time. A lot of times I'll hear agents go into a listing presentation. They'll say, I think your home is worth this. It's worth 1.2. Well, it's not what you think. I would always approach it where I think your property is lovely. And when you go into a property, make sure you point out the good points of that property because there is an emotional attachment for the seller. But when you walk in and say, I think your property is beautiful, but I don't dictate the price, the market dictates the price. It's what the market thinks it's worth at this point in time, and it will change. So that being said, let me show you why. And that's why you have proper CMAs, you have comparables, all of those wonderful tools that we have to allow that to happen. The other thing is fear of losing money. Someone looks at a property and they say, I thought I was going to get $1 million for this townhouse, and now you're telling me it's only worth $799. What am I going to do? Where am I going to live? Remember, you have to explain if someone is purchasing another property, what they lose on the property that they're selling, they are going to gain on the property they're purchasing because that will be lower as well. Assuming you're buying and selling in the same market, right? Obviously, it's different if they're selling a property and they're not buying another property. But all of these things have to be communicated effectively to the seller to allow them to trust you, to rely on what you're doing, and to understand what their true worth of their property is at that time. So it's reality versus acceptance, and they don't always go hand in hand. And just to let you know, anybody that's in cyberspace here, we have a handout. There's a digital version that is in the link below for the chat so that you can go through that. It has the kind of data that we're going through out so you can take it away with you, 1 to 11. And I will go through that as well, just to let you know. But to proceed with this, we'll keep going. So we have to look at the seller's journey and how we manage that expectation from the intro all the way to the live listing. For example, in the introduction, what you're doing in the introduction is you're getting to know the seller, you're getting to know the property, you are actually preparing for that initial meeting that you're having. So how do you prepare for that meeting? And again, managing the seller's expectation is all about knowledge. If you know what properties sold for recently, if you know what properties have sat on the market and why they've sat on the market, if you know the streets that are on, the house beside you is a lot more value because it's an end unit, whereas yours is an inside unit, so you can't have a basement apartment, et cetera, et cetera. You have to gather all that information before you go to the presentation and the meeting. Once you get to the meeting, it's all about understanding what the seller's expectations are and trying to manage that expectation. Now, what I would say is a lot of people argue that you're going to go with a CMA. I don't understand how you would go with a CMA to a property you've never seen before because you don't know what it looks like inside. So I would say I would bring a GeoWarehouse report. I would bring some comparables, but in terms of a CMA, and I'm sure people will argue with me on this, I can't tell you what your house is worth until I walk through the property. I don't know if you have shag rug carpets from 1970. I don't know if your basement's finished or if there's a side door walk-up basement apartment. I don't know any of that until I see it. So be prepared, but prepared enough that you can have a meaningful conversation with the sellers, but you don't necessarily have a CMA with you. Does anybody in the room ever bring a CMA before they see a property? No? Everyone's very quiet.
Or selling?
If you're listing a property for somebody, have you ever brought a CMA before you've seen the property? Because you can't do that, but I see people try and do that. Then there's the listing preparation. So when we talk about the listing prep, it's all about, again, the expectation is what do we have to do to prepare it in the seller's journey and how that feels in terms of, is it going to be staged? Is it going to be vacant? Is there a tenant in there? All of those things have to be communicated because all of those things inevitably affect the price of the property. If you have a property that has a tenant in it and the property is an absolute mess and you know that you're not going to be able to refresh and paint and everything, that's going to be reflected in the price. And you have to communicate that to the sellers. Look, it's a wonderful house, but you've been renting out the property for 15 years. Everything's original. It's been worn down. The carpet's all stained, all of those things. And then you have that conversation. And in other terms, the other thing is, what if it's a beautiful property and nothing needs to be done? Well, then you're obviously going to expect a better value for that. But it also depends on location. When it comes to location, you can have an immaculate, beautiful home that's been redone. You know, the regentrification where they knock down an old wartime house, they put up this big, beautiful house, but all the other houses on the street are only worth X amount of money. So no matter how beautiful this house is, if it's the top house on the market, you won't necessarily get exactly what you would get if it was in a neighborhood that was already regentrified. So you have to take into account all of that and communicate that to the seller. Then we go to the listing and the live listing. So this is the most important part because this is where the expectation really sets in. The seller has an expectation, we'll say 1.5 million for a property. Let's say it's in Richmond Hill or Thornhill. They have the property listed for 1.5 million. You know that it's worth about 135, but they've insisted that it's 1.5. This is why it's so important in a CMA, you don't give them an exact price. What you give them is a range. So when you do a comparative market analysis and you say, I think your home is worth this, it should be, I think your home's worth between 1.4 and 1.5 million. Now, it doesn't have to be that big a range, but it should be within $50,000. And the reason you do this is you're setting the expectation down the road. Because what the seller will say is, you think it's worth between 1.4 and 1.5. Well, let's list it for 1.5. They're not going to say, let's list it for 1.4. And then what you can now say to them is, listen, we're going to run with this for 2 weeks. I'm going to do my Facebook ads. We're going to do the open houses. And then we're going to review and look at how many showings we received, if we received any offers in that. And if nothing happens, then we need to come back and review the price because maybe it's on the lower end of that estimate that I gave you. And the idea of doing that is if you set the expectation in the very beginning, if it gets to a point where there's no showings in that, no fault of anybody's, it's just the market, that now the expectation is already there that you could lower it down to 1.4, which is kind of more in line with what the market thinks it's worth. Make sense? So always do a range on a CMA. I would never do an exact price. You can do the exact price once you discuss it with them, but with a CMA, I would do a price range. And also with the live listing, we have some amazing technology. Actually, they've really improved it with Realm, and we're going to talk about list track and that because that will help you manage the seller's expectation as well. Again, I'm only talking the negative because the whole premise of this presentation is the sellers are not happy because the property is not selling. And who's the first person to look forward to talk to about it? It's the agent. So the intro, like I said, I do not dictate the price, the market does. You're putting the onus on the market, not on yourself. You're on their team. You agree with them. It's the market that is the beast. My online marketing strategies are ahead of the standard. This is very important because when we talk about sellers' expectations, a lot of sellers expect every agent to do the same thing. They put it on MLS, they do an open house, and they wait. But you have to explain to them that you have other online marketing strategies that will help you get more exposure for that. Whether it's Spotlight, where you're going to have its own dedicated website, and then you can show the stats on that every week of how many people have visited it above list track, whether it is the Instagram feeds or Telegram feeds that you use, whether it's Facebook ads, depending on where you're selling and what it is, maybe it's print, because I see a lot of ads going back into print now, like Sing Sao magazine and things like that. But the idea is that you're going to explain to them that your online marketing strategies are stronger. I am the expert in residential sales in the area, and you're going to show past examples of listings. Why are you doing that? Because the expectation is that you are the expert in the area and that you market your stuff as effectively as possible, that you're on their team. So for example, if your last listing was a condo down in Toronto and now you have a $2 million listing, you better ensure that that listing you had in Toronto was amazing. You got HDR photos, you didn't take them with your phone, that you got a floor plan, all of those things. Because remember, no matter how valuable the listing is, whether it's a $600,000 condo or $2 million house, the expectation will be from the seller that you are going to do as much as possible by showing them a previous listing. That is your advertising for the next listing. So make sure that you always, always, always do a bang up job on every single listing you do because that's your ad for the next listing presentation going forward. The meeting. Let's talk about the meeting. So we talked about the comparable market analysis. We talk about the Geo Warehouse report. We talk about explaining the process of how it works and positive affirmation of their home. I was in Thornhill a couple of weeks ago doing this presentation, and there was an agent that was very transparent, and he said, I think I went overboard and I lost the listing. And the reason he lost it is he walked in the house. He said it was a nice house, but there was quite a few things that needed updating, and I made sure they knew. I said, this all has to be repainted, and this doesn't look good, and this carpet's all worn out. You got to rip that out. And he says, I started to realize very quickly as their faces kind of drew down that I went a little too far with telling them how bad their house was. He goes, because they basically gave the listing to someone else. So remember, when you're doing a listing presentation, you need to be realistic with the seller, but there's no problem with positive affirmation of the home. So for example, if you walk into a house and you know the entire kitchen needs updating, whether it's old cupboards, it's the knobs, all that stuff, you find something positive in the house. Wow, look at how big this kitchen space is. This is great. It's a little bit dated for today's expectation, but maybe we can fix that, do a little painting here, but I'll tell you, what a great space for entertaining. So you're still getting your point across that the kitchen is outdated, but at the same time, you're not insulting anyone because remember, there is an emotional attachment for every seller in the home. Geo Warehouse report. Why do I pull the Geo Warehouse report? What's the reason for that? Anybody? Very quiet. Okay, so let's talk about it. It shows the transactional history, of course. That gives you an idea of maybe where they are. If they've been in the house for 20 years, chances are their mortgage is paid off and you'll have a better expectation level with pricing. But if you look at the Geo Warehouse and they bought the house in 2019 for 100,000 more than it's worth right now, there's going to be a discussion about price for sure, and it's going to be challenging. So that's one of the reasons. The other reason is you can see who's on title, make sure it's the right people, all of those wonderful things. And explaining the process. Explain the process of how it works with how many days on the market, what it's like when there's a buyer's market, the challenge you have, what process you're going to take, whether it is we're going to go low and hold back on offers, or we're going to price it right at market value, or maybe slightly below market value. All of those things are important, but the thing I haven't touched on yet is communication. Communication is the absolute key for managing expectations of a seller. So many times you'll have an agent go, "Oh, the seller's mad at me. I haven't talked to him in 2 weeks." And I go, "Why haven't you talked to him in 2 weeks?" "Well, I got nothing to say. The house isn't selling." Well, then reach out to them and say, "Hey, just to let you know, I reached out to a couple of people that saw it. They're still looking, etc." Have a reason to reach out to the seller, because while you're busy doing other things and with buyers and all that other stuff, that seller is lamenting in their house thinking, "Why did my house not sell yet?" That's all they're thinking about. Every day they get up and they have to put their laundry away and make sure it's ready for showings, all of that stuff. It is front and foremost in their brain. So make sure you're communicating with them. So has anyone heard of the pricing pyramid? If you look at the, I think I have it here on the handout. I'm trying to see where it is here. Pricing pyramid concept, it's number 2. So this is a really neat thing because you look like it's kind of an upside down pyramid, okay? So when you look at that, let's talk about the pricing pyramid. It's not that complicated. It basically says if you look at market value, you've got a 60% buyer pool. So what that means is 60% of the people that are buying in that area, chances are they'll be looking at your property because it's priced right. If you're 5% over the market value, now you're down to 50% buyer pool. And it goes on, 10% down to 30%, 15% over market down to 20%. When you get 20% over market value, you've only got 10% of that buyer pool. So it's a really interesting concept. So visualize how the pool of buyers shrinks as the price increases. Help sellers understand that demand is price driven. It is always price driven. They always say there's 2 things that sell a house, price and location, but you can't move the house, so it's price. Just saying. That's what it is. So sometimes if you do the pricing pyramid and you explain that to them, it makes it a little easier to understand, because what you want, let's be honest, the true thing you want is you want at least 2 offers. If you can get 2 offers, that pricing pyramid goes out the door, and now you can drive the price up a little bit because people get emotionally attached once they put something on paper. And this has nothing to do with what I'm talking about, but just a tidbit of advice. Anytime an agent calls you and says, "Hey, will your clients take $799?" do not negotiate verbally on the phone. You always say, "Put it on paper. Let's work with it. Put it on paper." You always want an offer on paper. Never, ever negotiate verbally. Just letting you know. What's the reason for that? 2 reasons. One, the agent could just be fishing. You're going to know if they're serious or not, and you want to make sure they're serious. But the main reason is because when somebody puts in an offer, even if it's lower, there is now an emotional attachment to that offer. There is something in their brain that changes that says, "I might have a chance of getting this house," whereas it's just fishing and talking out of the blue. The other thing is always try and sign back on an offer. I know this has nothing to do with it, but while we're talking about it, always try and sign back on an offer, even if it's low, because you'd be surprised how many times I've seen somebody go 100,000 below my seller's expectation. I sign back, 20,000 less, and all of a sudden they come right up $50,000. They just want to see if the house is for sale. Anyway, talking about that, that is called the pricing pyramid. It's kind of a visual. I've left it on the screen for a little bit so you can take a look at it. It's an interesting concept and it works. Listing preparation, we're on the next one. So home preparation, what do? We paint, we clean, we do curb appeal, we do staging, we do photos, we do a marketing plan, we do floor plans, we do paperwork. These are all the things we prepare for the listing. Again, it's all about communication. How do you manage the seller's expectation? You tell them exactly what you're going to do and how you're going to do it, whether that comes to painting, cleaning, curb appeal, staging photos, all of those things. And the other thing is this, even if it came to someone that, let's say someone's not, because we all know we have sellers and buyers on the fence right now. Let's say someone says to you, look, I'm not buying another place. I'm moving in with my kids. I'm downsizing. Should I sell the house right now? I know the answer for every realtor is now's the best time to sell, of course. But let's be honest. Let's say the springtime's a better market, right? Let's say, 2 months from now is a better time, whatever that is. Don't be afraid to say to that person, listen, the weather's really nice right now. Let me get the outside photos done of the house because I want to get those done. So by the time you finish preparing the inside, it's not crappy weather out and it still looks good for curb appeal, et cetera, et cetera. There's all different ways to manage that expectation, but you want them to see that you're on their team and you're on their side. Let's go to managing the live listing expectation. This is the most important part. Now you've got it live, the listing's up. Parisa, you have a listing that's going up, what, today? So,
Sorry.
is it going up today, the listing? Thursday. And how much are you listing it for? 1.189. What do you think the house is worth, honestly?
Between 1.140 and
So you're about what, 40,000 overpriced? That's what you're telling me right now? So I'm just using these. They pushed, of course. Yeah. So I'm just using an example. There's an agent in the office right now. She's doing a new listing. I've actually seen the property. It's down the road from the office. It's a nice house, but the expectation is 1.189. And really the house is worth about 140, 140, sorry. So she's going to have this exact challenge. So when the listing goes live, the expectation, you use communication, you use visuals, and you use communication. So let's talk about that right now. Daily updates. This could include follow-up of showings, feedback, recent sales in the area, market update, new strategies, open house, etc. You need to be communicating with your seller on a regular basis. I like to say for the first 2 weeks, absolutely daily. But if you can't, do it every other day or every 3 days. The seller wants to hear from you. They are waiting. They're at work all day. They come home. Has anything happened? Do I have to clean my house again? So digital tools are available. Let's talk about those digital tools. We have multiple ones. My favorite, which I'm surprised because it's provided by Treb and they didn't always provide the best things, is ListTrack. Does everybody know what ListTrack is? For any of you who don't know what ListTrack is, if you go into PropTX, where you go to log into SkySlope or Realm and that, on the right-hand side, or sorry, inside Realm on the dots, the 9 dots that are at the top right corner, if you go down to the bottom, it's the second one up from the left. It's called ListTrack. If anybody wants to check that out. What ListTrack does is it tracks your listings. So if you have a listing, let's say you have a 4-bedroom detached house in Newmarket, and you go to track that listing, you can click on it and it will create a report. And that report will tell you how many people have viewed the property. It'll tell you where they viewed the property, where they're from. It'll tell you what source they viewed the property on. So whether it's realtor.ca, whether it's a Century 21 site, all of that stuff all the way down. And then it will tell you how many people favored the listing, how many people looked at the photos, how many people, it's very detailed. It will also tell you how many people reoccurred. So it could say 40% of all visitors to your property came back a second and third time to look at the property. It is a very powerful tool. I set it up. I would suggest you set it up that report goes out weekly to your clients. It can be automated. You get a copy of it. It looks really nice. And what it does is it keeps that line of communication open. Why it's so important, especially when you get to a conversation where someone says, look, what are you doing to sell my house? Like, it's not happening. And you have to have that difficult conversation to say, look, it's 50,000 over. We need to drop the price. You now have visuals and communication to prove that. For example, if you look at a report by ListTrack and it's showing there's 1,100 views this week and all these people favored it and you didn't have any showings, it's definitely price. They're waiting for it. If they favored it, they're waiting for the price to drop to be more reasonable. So there's also Realm. We know that you could send other things by Realm. You could just when someone gets a listing, they stop looking at that area, and you shouldn't do that. You should be looking at any new houses that got listed, any properties that got sold, and I'll tell you why, because your seller's doing that. Whether they're doing it on the House Sigma app or they're doing it on Realm, they are looking. How many times could you be listing a house and all of a sudden the seller calls you, you haven't talked to him in a couple of days, you're like, oh, I should have called Jennifer. Jennifer calls and says, what, that other house just sold on our street, what did it sell for? And you have no idea. You need to be on top of that. Managing the seller's expectation is having the knowledge before they do. So remember, use Realm, still constantly look at that area. And then there's Remarketer. And Remarketer can be used for communication so that you can check when they've responded or not responded. You can use Remarketer for the live listing for advertising, put the listing in, sending it out to your sphere of influence. There's lots of ways to do that. Just make sure you're communicating. And here's an example of what it looks like. So this is the online analytics report from ListTrack, okay? So if you take a look at it, it says stats for the period, let's say August 8th to September 9th. So I picked 200 Alex Gardner Circle. There's the report date. It shows the top 10 websites that it came from. It shows the top 10 cities in the past 30 days of people that looked at it. So most people from Toronto looked at it, 80 property views. But what else is interesting is it shows 32 people favored it, 45 people shared it, and 1,526 people viewed it. Now, here's the other good thing. I don't know how many people use Spotlight or don't use Spotlight, whether you use your own photographer or not. I always use Spotlight because it gives me the dedicated web page with the 14 different languages. It does all the schools, the commute time and everything. The reason I like Spotlight is when I would go to a listing presentation, I would say, my online marketing strategies go above and beyond other realtors. Now I can send them this analytic report and I can send them the Spotlight report, which might show another 450, 500 people that visited that site. Now it looks like you're giving them even more exposure. So that's why I would do that. But again, managing the expectation of the seller is giving them the information. Make sense? So let's look at the new one. Price change or new strategy? That's always a question. I have a lot of realtors ask me all the time, should I change the price or should I relist? What is the difference? Does anybody know that? The difference between changing the price and relisting? Days on market. Treb don't actually want you to cancel and relist, just so you know. They prefer you just do a price change. Now, when can a relist be detrimental? When is it bad to do a relist? It's bad if you've done it multiple times in a row. If every 2 weeks you're relisting the property because they just think you're hiding something. Here's my thought process. Everyone else has a different opinion. I prefer to put it on the market, price it right the first time. But if you don't price it right the first time because you're getting pressure from the sellers, et cetera, after 2 or 3 weeks, we look at that, review it, cancel it, do a relist right away at the price reduction. If it's on the market for a few more weeks after that, I wouldn't do another relist. I would just do a price reduction. And I would send an email out to all the past people that had viewed the property through Broker Bay. I would send a remarketer blast to everyone, hey, we've just done a price reduction. It's a beautiful house. Have a relook at this, etc. Because what you don't want to do is cancel and relist multiple times. It gets confusing to people and they don't understand why you're doing it. So price change versus a relist. At first, I would do a relist. At second, after, I would probably do a price change. Anybody have a different opinion of that? No? Everyone's quiet about that? Okay, what about the holding back on offers, below market drive showings? What's your thought about that in a buyer's market? It's okay to talk if everyone's a little nervous, quiet about it. If you had a listing right now, would you hold back on offers? No? The answer is no? And is that for every listing or is that just in new market? What are you thinking?
Pretty much every.
Every listing. Why is that? I'm not disagreeing. I'm just asking why.
It's not a strategy to take right now. It'll actually throw people off. Usually offers that come in are coming in far under asking.
Far under asking, yeah.
So people think that's the actual value you're looking for or less than.
So I tend to agree with what he's saying. Right now, when it's a buyer's market, I think I've seen it done. I've seen it's bold. I would do it. I would only do it on a sub kind of $800,000 property. The reason I would do that is that market becomes a little more secure than all the rest of the market. Let me explain. So if I have a let's say a normal house in Newmarket, detached 3 or 4 bedroom home, is going to be over $1 million in Newmarket. I'm not going to price that at $899 and hold back on offers because everybody knows it's not $899, and I don't think it's going to be worthwhile to do that. But if I have, let's say, a small townhouse or something that's going to go for $750, I might hold back on offers on that, even in a buyer's market, bring it down low, because when the market's really bad in terms of nobody's buying, I find the one part that's still safe is the sub $800,000 level, because you've still got first time buyers that now they're like, I can afford to get in the market. You still got downsizers and you've still got investors. But the plus $1 million market, in my opinion, that's the one that gets hit the most. The $1.5 million house goes to 1.3. The $900,000 condo goes to 780. Those are the ones that get hit the most. But in terms of the submarket, that would be the only time that I would maybe hold back on offers in this market. And again, it's subjective, a lot of people. But right now, with a buyer's market, I would price it right. And just to give you some stats on that, in a balanced market, usually you will get 95% of asking. That's really what the expectation is. In a balanced market, if you price a house properly, you're going to get anywhere between 100 and 95% of asking. In a buyer's market, I have seen it as low as 85% of asking, just to let you know. I'm not saying it's right. I'm saying that the problem is sometimes people are desperate, they need to sell, et cetera, et cetera. So if you're going to price your property, like he said, Lorenzo said, I really wouldn't hold back on offers right now in general, because they're going to think that's the expectation and they're going to come around that. Even in multiple offers, they're only going to maybe give you asking. They're not going to be going 100, 150,000 above like a normal hot market. I think it's kind of a waste of time. The other thing is this: if you're going to hold back on offers, you don't hold back on offers for 2 weeks, not in this market. If you're actually going to hold back on offers, you do it for 1 week. Reason being is there's so much inventory right now that all that's going to happen is you're going to say, we're not accepting offers until 2 weeks from Tuesday. They're going to see 50 other properties before they see yours, before the offer date, and they're going to change their mind.